Lindsay, and I'm the Vice President of the Lane League of Women Voters. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our speaker series, including our lifetime allies who've been doing the work of the League for more than 50 years. Could you stand up or raise your hand? How about raise your hand? Thank you for lighting the way. This event caps off a remarkable speaker series season where we examined a variety of issues that are critical to our democracy, starting all the way back in September when we welcomed Mayor Karin Knudsen. We've since hosted visits with our Secretary of State, Oregon's Attorney General, State Representative Lisa Fragala, and now Professor Emeritus Tim Gleason. Thank you. Before we dig into today's topic, we have some special people to thank for making all of this happen. So please welcome to the podium Linda Ferdosian, Rhonda Livesey, and Ruth Seeger.
Hello. How's that? Hey, on behalf of all of our members, we want to take a moment today to acknowledge, thank you for that, to acknowledge and thank some special team members who've worked hard to bring us this year's speaker series. Today's program with Dr. Gleason is another example of their outstanding efforts to bring us experts on important topics. The content team, the cashier team, and our logistics lead have been doing a lot of heavy lifting, and we need to thank them today. So I'm going to ask them to stand up. Callie Ackley and Michelle Postal and Peggy Dane and Kitty Piercy. And there's another one. Yep. These guys right here. Thank you guys, they did tremendous work. And our cashier team are fantastic people that keep track of all of us and manage our finances. We thank you. Marge Maxwell, please stand up. Patty Sandos, Susan Dan, Flo Delaney, Pam Berrien, Ann O'Brien. Thank you so much. Thank you for your patience with us. Is Ann here today? Ann O'Brien? Don't see her. Okay, can you hold that for me? And last but not least, the fantastic Judy Abel. Judy's been doing a tremendous amount of coordination ever since January to bring you lots of good things. So thank you guys. You four up here are like rock stars, so we bow to you. Thank you.
Thanks again to this great team for pulling together this season of the speaker series. I have just a few announcements before we hear from our guest. First, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. We are recording the event and we'll post it later on our YouTube page. Thank you so much. Next, today's the deadline to register to vote in the primary election on May 19th. So I want to encourage everyone after the program to go online to Oregon Votes to verify that you'll receive a ballot. You'll need to indicate that you're a Democrat or Republican if you'd like to vote for any of the partisan candidates, like governor, senator, or state representative. And let's be clear, you should want to vote for these partisan candidates. Most people think elections are decided in November, but in reality, many races are effectively settled months before during the primaries. If you skip that step, you're often missing your only real chance to shape who represents you. When more people participate in primaries, candidates must appeal to a broader range of voters, not just the most partisan few. Your ballot carries more weight in these low turnout contests, and casting it helps ensure the options in November better reflect your community. So we've got volunteers in the reception area outside who can help you with your voter registration before you leave. Finally, a special mention to all of our members in the audience. I'm counting on each of you to join us in this room Saturday, May 9th at 9 a.m. for our annual meeting where we'll celebrate the end of one year and prepare for the next. We'll ask you to weigh in on the budget, program of study, and the next slate of officers and board of directors. We also promise mimosas, door prizes, and lots of socializing with other defenders of democracy. Your engagement during this election year is critical, and we look forward to seeing you here. Now I'm delighted to turn our attention to Tim Gleason, Professor Emeritus and former Dean of the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication. Democracy depends on people knowing what their government is doing. And without independent journalists gathering and publishing that information, voters are making decisions in the dark. The First Amendment bars Congress from passing any law that restricts press freedom, placing it among the most protected rights in the American system. But that protection isn't ceremonial. It underpins nearly every other function of democratic life, from holding officials accountable to safeguarding individual liberties. The League of Women Voters supports credible and ethical local journalism, in whatever format it is published, as essential to our democracy. We also believe it is the responsibility of government to provide support for conditions under which credible local journalism can survive and thrive. A recent report from the Inter-American Press Association, however, singled out the United States for the steepest decline in press freedom in the Americas in the past year. Changes under the current administration were cited as a primary factor, including funding cuts to public media, the closure of Voice of America, and the stigmatization of critical journalism. At least 170 attacks against journalists covering federal immigration agents have also raised concerns. We are eager for Professor Gleason's context and analysis. Professor Gleason retired in December 2021 after more than 34 years as a teacher and scholar. His scholarship focused on the theory, history, and practice of freedom of the press, exploring questions such as the origins of the watchdog concept in libel law, the legal definition of journalist, and public meetings and public records law, all very near and dear to our League hearts. Professor Gleason served as Dean of the School of Journalism and Communication from 1997 to 2013, and he was a recipient of the 2012 Scripps Howard Foundation Journalism Administrator of the Year Award. He has served on the boards of Open Oregon, an organization that advocates for government transparency, the Oregon Newspaper Publishers Association, the Oregon Association of Broadcasters, and the KLCC Foundation. He was also an informal advisor to the launch of Lookout Eugene Springfield. Please welcome Professor Gleason.
Well, thank you, Barbara. It's really a joy to be here today, and I'm especially touched that I'm ending a series that started with Corinne Knudsen, who was my student many, many years ago, but whose career and whose service to the city of Eugene is something that I'm very proud of to see her doing. And I must also say I greatly appreciate the work the League does. It's incredibly important in this never more important than it is today. I never thought that I would see a day in the United States where the integrity of elections was in question, and yet here we are. So there are two full disclosures I need to make before I get into my comments. The first is that when I was teaching, my goal was always that by the end of the class, yes. Is that better? Thank you. And when I was teaching, my goal was always that by the end of the class, the students wouldn't really know what my political position was. And if they thought they knew, I encouraged them in writing final papers and what have you to argue the opposite side of that position and make a strong fact-based argument to counter whatever they thought my position was. Today, it's irresponsible to hide one's political views pertaining to the current administration. On a daily basis, the Trump administration is taking actions that undermine democracy in America. To a degree, I mean, just today, and we'll come back to it perhaps, there are at least two events today that highlight what this administration is doing. The second full disclosure is that when the internet emerged, there was this wonderful sort of glorious future ahead of us where, everyone could be a journalist and the internet was going to make democracy work really well, and so much for that. The technology did enable us to all be journalists, but it didn't make us journalists. And the fact is that doing fact-based, ethical, well-researched, and carefully edited journalism requires time, resources, and training. And this is not to say or minimize the value or the contributions of independent journalists, of podcasters, of all the thousands of voices that we hear out there or can hear out there, and the cacophony that is the internet on a daily basis. But it is to say that there's a significant difference between doing journalism and voicing your opinion, fact-based or otherwise. And so with those full disclosures, let me move on to today's topic, which is challenges to freedom of the press. And I'm going to start at a macro level and talk a little bit about kind of the international context, move on to the national context, and then finally to the local context. And I'm going to watch the clock because I probably could talk for 3 or 4 hours, but will not do that to you. On the international level, we as citizens of the United States, we tend to think we're special, and we don't really think much about freedom of the press in other countries, except to say that we're better than they are. That's kind of the way we generally think about it. But it's really important that we understand the challenges faced in the rest of the world so that we understand the world in which we live in, and also what could and what is happening here. So I just want to give you a couple of bullets from the Values of Democracy Institute, which is an independent research institution based in Sweden, and then the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is based in the United States. Freedom of expression continues to be the most attacked aspect of democracy, worsening in 45 countries in 2025. The U.S., as was noted earlier in the introduction, the U.S. lost its long-term status as a liberal democracy for the first time in 50 years. And this is based on a variety of metrics having to do with freedom of the press and other individual rights, and especially voting rights in all countries. And this is the one that I found most stunning when I first read it, and that's the contrast between autocracies and democracies. The world has 92 autocracies and 87 democracies at the end of 2025. But 74% of the world population now live in autocracies. Only 7% of the world population live in liberal democracies. So I think China explains a lot of that. But I find that to just be stunning, to think that such a small percentage of the world lives in what we would consider liberal democracies that practice and believe in freedom of the press. So there is little to no press freedom where there are autocratic governments, and the threat to jail or other possible bad outcomes, has a strong chilling effect on journalistic behavior. In 2025, 130 journalists and media workers were killed, 334 were imprisoned, and 85 are missing. So when we think about that in the United States, we don't tend to think that most journalists die here, or for that matter, get jailed. But that kind of climate has a chilling effect on every journalist. You tend to think a little bit more about what you're doing. So that's just kind of, again, kind of big picture context on the international scene. On the national scene, I want to talk about the First Amendment, but I also want to talk about the economic circumstances that currently face journalism, because they have a significant impact on the ability to do journalism and practice freedom of the press. There are two concepts, or three things that I want you to pay attention to in terms of the legal side of the equation. One is a First Amendment concept called viewpoint discrimination. It is a violation of the First Amendment for the government to take any action based on the viewpoint of an individual. Now, that's not to say that you don't have policy differences, but policy differences are a different matter. But the government cannot take an action against an individual because they don't like what the person said. The second kind of basic First Amendment principle is what's called prior restraint. The government may not stop speech before it happens. You can punish speech if that speech is an incitement to violence or several other very narrow categories, but the government may not engage in prior restraint, in stopping speech before it happens. So those are two very important principles that can be applied outside the First Amendment realm, but are critical to understanding what the government may or may not do and what's a threat to free speech. The third that I want you to be aware of are the ongoing efforts to overturn Times versus Sullivan. Times versus Sullivan was the libel decision in 1964 that created greater protection for journalists. It created a standard called actual malice that I'm not going to go into. But it makes it much more difficult for a plaintiff who is a public official or a public figure to win a libel suit. So, for example, let us just say that, the Attorney General of the United States files a libel suit against, the Atlantic magazine. In order to win that suit, the Attorney General has to prove that the Atlantic acted with actual malice, that it knew that what it was publishing was false, or it didn't care that what it published was false. Anyone who knows the Atlantic knows that that's an absurd claim. But what we're seeing at the Supreme Court, Justices Thomas and Gorsuch have written dissents in which they have essentially suggested that we ought to get rid of New York Times versus Sullivan. The New York Times versus Sullivan provides too much protection for freedom of the press. And there are several other, and there's actually a wonderful book called Murder the Truth by David Enrich that came out about a year ago. Absolutely wonderful book that details the concerted effort, the campaign, if you will, that goes beyond those two justices to erode the protections of Times versus Sullivan. So those are three important First Amendment items to think about. Moving outside the narrow context of the law, another major First Amendment question, if you will, is media consolidation. If you look at what's happening, two current examples of potential consolidations that are under review. One is the Paramount Times Warner consolidation, which is problematic if you're on one hand just from the consolidation part of it, that it by all reports it will result in fewer jobs, fewer movies being made, things of that sort. It also will give control to the Ellison family, who are very good friends of Donald Trump. I have no problem with media owners having a political point of view, but I do have a problem with the government helping their friends get through antitrust issues and get a deal, if you will. So that's one merger that's certainly worth paying attention to, and we'll see what happens there, although it looks likely that it's going to happen. The other is the Nexstar-Tegna merger. This is a merger of two television companies. If the merger goes through, the new company will have access to 80% of TV households. There are federal regulations, FCC regulations, that are intended to limit television ownership precisely to avoid that kind of concentrated ownership. But that merger, which is currently, again, on hold, is for antitrust reasons. Depending on who you listen to or who you read, will or will not happen. But it is moving forward, but slowly. Just a data point, the 5 largest local newspaper chains own over 15% of the country's dailies and weeklies. So 5 companies own 15% of all newspapers. And we'll come back to that in a minute. The third point I want to talk about on the national level, and again I'm speaking in broad terms here because I'm seeing the clock ticking, is just the rise of social media, which again we think as being a wonderful thing, and in ways it is, at times it is, and if you're careful it is. But there's actually a very important critical element of it that really doesn't get talked about very much. And that is the notion of public square. We have, because of the internet and social media, we have essentially turned the public square into a private square. Because at the moment, Google and Meta, to a significant degree, have control over what we see and hear. Now, as long as they're acting ethically, responsibly, caring about the public interest, all things we could argue about or talk about, that's fine. But what if they're not? So if you think about it in kind of a newspaper metaphor, newspapers were delivered on public streets. They were controlled by the public. They were, no one could stop the New York Times truck or the Register Guard truck from going down the street. But if Google tomorrow were to decide we're not going to allow that to happen, that content, that publication, that for whatever reason, theoretically they could because it's their street. So I think that's an important thing to just think about as we move forward in terms of regulation of media. Meta and Google, we kind of talked about them a little bit, and we'll come back to them later in a few minutes, become very critical players in all of this, and the players that we need to be paying attention to. And the third is, or another thing to be thinking about, we're not going to talk about it, is artificial intelligence, and what artificial intelligence is doing and will do as we go forward. So to go back to the legal side of this for a moment, and I want to quote here from a letter that Joyce Berman, where's Joyce? Is she here? Well, Joyce sent me a great email a few days ago, and I had seen the letter, but I'd forgotten about it. The White House Correspondents Association had sent a letter, 250 journalists had sent a letter, rather, to the White House Journalists Association, asking them to not invite Donald Trump to speak at the dinner the other night, which as we know, became a critical moment in U.S. history. But anyway, in this letter, the 250 journalists said the following, quote, "This represents the most systematic and comprehensive assault on freedom of the press by a sitting American president," and then listed this list, and I want to read the list because I think it summarizes a lot. regulatory ban on reporters, regulatory investigations weaponizing against critical outlets, frivolous lawsuits meant to bleed media organizations dry, move to defund public broadcasting, the gutting of international broadcasters, physical restrictions on journalists trying to cover protests in the Iran war, public attacks on individual reporters by name, and arrests of journalists on the job while Trump turned around and pardoned people who committed violence against the press. I think that's a pretty good summary. So the last thing I'll note on the national level is what happened this morning. As you may be aware, yesterday the First Lady was very upset about Jimmy Kimmel's commentary the night, 2 or 3 nights ago, which was, quite honestly, having seen it, you know, he could have done better. It was not in the best of taste. So be it. He's a comedian. He gets to do what he wants to do. And Melania Trump also has the right to say, I don't like that. That's fine. However, as of this morning, the Federal Communications Commission is threatening the licenses of the 8 owned and operated stations that Disney owns that are ABC affiliates. So Melania Trump can say what she wishes to, but the White House cannot, and Brendan Carr at the FCC cannot then say, okay, we're going to take away the license of 8 television stations because we don't like what you said. It's also worth noting that, and this the last time Jimmy Kimmel got the White House mad at him, you may remember that Sinclair Corporation, which owns 2 of the television stations in Eugene, and which is a very conservative, politically conservative outfit, suspended Kimmel for a couple of days and then brought him back. They have said nothing about this today, but again, they have over 40 ABC television station licenses. And when Melania Trump stands up and says, I don't like what you said and they should take away your, they should fire you, that's not just a private individual standing up and saying something. It's a threat from the government against a speaker. So, to go to the local situation for just a moment, and I knew I was going to end up running out of time. A couple of things. First, public records. When we talk about freedom of the press, one of the most important things for journalists is being able to get information from governmental agencies. And prior to coming today, I had conversations with reporters at most of the news organizations in Eugene. And one of the things that people said, and this is not a new problem or a new phenomenon, is simply the difficulty of getting public records. In other words, when you file a public records request to an agency, that agency under law has certain time limits in when they're supposed to respond. There are certain waivers that can be given if you are a journalist or the request is in the public interest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And journalists generally tend to complain about government agency response. That's kind of a standard complaint. Interestingly enough, and I'm not going to go into what agencies, but I heard from a number of journalists in town particular complaints about particular agencies. Having been involved in public records for a very long time, it wasn't surprising, but I note it as an issue, a freedom of the press issue. Second, and the rest of this really gets down more to the economic side of this equation. We've all watched the decline of local journalism here and elsewhere. It's important to understand that, on the one hand, it's because of the loss of advertising, but the loss of advertising is largely the fact of a loss of attention. We live in an attention economy. The reason journalists are successful, the reason podcasts are successful, the reason anything is successful is because you pay attention to it. And if you don't pay attention to it, it's not successful. And one of the things that's happened in local journalism is they've lost the advertiser and they've lost the attention. People are not paying attention to them to the degree that they have to. And the result of that is fewer journalists, less coverage, fewer publications. I mentioned Google and Meta, and they come back to them in a second. Out-of-state ownership. I think it's worth noting, if you're not aware, that if 15 years ago in this community, most of the news organizations in this community were locally owned. There were families that owned them. They cared about the community. They brought money into the community. They kept that money here. They cared deeply about Eugene, about Oregon. Well, KEZI is now owned by Allen Media Broadcasting, which is located in California. KMTR, KVAL are owned by Sinclair Broadcasting, which I mentioned before. The Register Guard is owned by USA Today, which used to be Gannett, which was Gatehouse for a while, and anyway, it's a large corporation. Carpenter Media recently purchased a number of news outlets in Oregon, most up on the coast and in Central Oregon. They own the Bulletin now and the Astorian and what have you. And there are fewer journalists in Oregon. Oregon newspapers lost 3/4 of their jobs in this century. 3/4 of their journalism jobs. Just to give you a couple of examples, well, I think a very telling example. The Register Guard in 2026 has 8 staff. In 2000, it had 80 plus. If you were to add, we did this on a napkin, so I'm not sure how accurate it is, but if you were to add up all the journalists in the Eugene-Springfield area, at all of the newspapers in Eugene-Springfield, you might hit 40, but I don't think so. You're probably closer to 30 total, covering all of Wayne County, really. Right. The largest newsroom in Eugene is Lookout Eugene-Springfield, which is very proud to proclaim that it has the largest newsroom between Portland and San Francisco. Who wants to guess how many journalists there are in the Lookout Eugene newsroom? 16. So who said 14? All right, Kitty, yes. You're on top of things. There have been closed newspapers, a whole list of closed newspapers in the state of Oregon, and more of them that are close to closing. So, what's happening that's on the, can I say anything positive before I end this? Yes. First of all, one of the things we're seeing is a combination of for-profit, not-for-profit, and grant funding. So if you look at, Lookout Eugene-Springfield is one example of that, where it is a for-profit corporation, but it's a public interest corporation, so it also has a not-for-profit side, if you will. It has a philanthropic side. The Chronicle, now in Springfield, used to be the Cresswell Chronicle, now in Springfield, and covering Cresswell and Cottage Grove, and looking to expand to cover more smaller communities in southern Oregon, or in the southern part of our valley. Has a not-for-profit side as well. So we're seeing more and more, and years ago I gave a speech to public radio, at a public radio conference. I said, you're not the only guys who are out there looking for grants or looking for public support and philanthropic support. Everyone's doing it now. Right? So that's one thing, and it's somewhat successful. The second is collaboration. If you look at things like OPB and KLCC, where there's a great deal of collaboration between those organizations. The Oregon Journalism Project, which some of you may be familiar with, which is kind of a ProPublica for Oregon. And so it's a not-for-profit, statewide organization that does investigative reporting. And it's you'll see their stories in Lookout, and you also see their stories, I think KLCC is a partner. The Weekly is, I think now again, a partner with them. The Capitol Chronicle, which used to be an EO or Eastern Oregon publication, but now is a collaboration of a bunch of local newspapers, and so you can go there and get stories from all around the state. Finally, last thing I want to talk about is legislative support. So there has been an effort in the last two sessions, well, in the last session and in the special session, to pass a bill that would require Google and Meta to enter into negotiations with news organizations in the state, because Google and Meta essentially steal from local news organizations. I mean, and if you go into Google, as I have done many times, and you say, what is da-da-da-da-da, and it gives you this AI summary. Well, it's getting that AI summary from somewhere, and frequently where it's getting from the news organizations. So traffic to news organizations is dropped because of that. So there are legislative efforts to fix that problem, and there are other efforts. One last one I'll hit you with is the Maryland legislature just passed a bill that is a advertising set aside for local newsrooms. So there's a law requiring that half of the state's advertising dollars be directed to community news outlets, establishing the nation's first statewide government advertising set aside. There are several other configurations trying to figure out ways to support journalism as a local public interest. And as this group knows better than probably any other group in the state, there's nothing more important than having informed voters. And the only way we have informed voters is if we have healthy, quality local journalism. And so these legislative efforts, hopefully we will be able to do something in Oregon that will address the problem that local journalism has, and also local advertisers will advertise in local media. So with that,
Thank you, Professor Gleason. There are cards in the middle of your tables for you to write questions, and there will be people circulating, picking them up to ask questions of Dr. Gleason. Okay, we've got a good starting line here. Given the myriad of choices for people to get information online, reliable and unreliable, how can people be encouraged to use reliable sources that use ethical journalism?
well, if I had a good answer for that, I'd be a highly paid consultant. One of the efforts to address that issue is in a number of universities around the country and other educational institutions, they're teaching news literacy courses, where the effort is to get people to understand how do I determine that this is in fact a reliable source. Because one of the things, and again, if you go back to AI and what we're seeing now in Google searches and what have you, is that that sometimes that information is accurate, sometimes it's not. So teaching people teaching them to be literate in terms of news organization, in terms of reading the news is important. Beyond that, really, I mean, it is the question, really, is how do we as a society get people to do what the people in this room do? Which is carefully read the news, compare sources, find reliable sources, and then be willing to pay for those reliable sources.
Given the current environment of attacks on journalism, are you finding that today's students are being discouraged from choosing journalism as a career?
No. I think one of the most fascinating things, and obviously I'm not in the classroom anymore, but I still stay pretty much in touch with the school, is students are excited. They want to do creative work. They want to do investigative reporting. They want to go out and tell stories. I mean, the journalism school talks now a lot about being a place for storytelling, and students want to tell stories, and they are so media literate in the sense of technologically literate, much more than, as I look around the room, any of us in this room. you can get them excited about it, and they go out and they do great work. So we're finding in the school, this school of journalism, actually enrollment is up, and in fact they're challenged with trying to handle the number of students who want. Now that's not true nationally, but here we have been able to continue to attract really good, excited students who do work that sometimes really your jaw just drops. I mean, it's just what they do.
So this person questions the background, the history background, world and U.S. history background of journalists, have noticed deficit in that area, and is wondering whether whether you found that to be true in the School of Journalism and Communication. Do you require history?
Well, the short answer is you're right, in the sense that students, this is a gross generalization, but for the most part, students do not come to the university with a firm grasp of history of the U.S. and certainly not international history. And I'm not sure we provided for them at the university, except for those who are history majors. I mean, we have a variety. The journalism is a liberal arts major, so there are a variety of requirements that require you to take courses. Mostly, a significant part of your curriculum is in the College of Arts and Sciences. But I think it's fair to say that a vast percentage of people graduating really don't have a great grasp of history. And to bring that down to the local level, I said earlier that maybe we have 30 journalists working in Eugene. Of those 30 journalists, I'm pretty comfortable saying no more than 5 have any understanding or knowledge of the history of Eugene. I mean, even down to who won the last election, or how do I find the county courthouse. And I think there are several people in this room, I think, who could speak to this, having had questions asked of them over the years that were not well informed. Is that true, Kitty? Yeah. So yeah, that's not a journalism problem. That's a national problem from my perspective. We do not educate students well in the history of this country, and internationally, it's even a greater problem.
Which breaks my heart as a history professor. What are the options for enhancing rural newspaper deserts? What kinds of communal efforts exist, such as small communities forming consortia?
Well, this is, I don't have the statistics right in front of me right now, but the news desert problem is greatest in rural communities. There are literally hundreds of counties in the United States that have no news source. Hundreds. And there's a study out of Washington State that looked at this problem in the Northwest and found vast deserts where there were no community news organizations, or the only news organization was was public radio, which actually does a better job than anyone else of reaching out into rural areas. The challenge of operating a small community newspaper really gets back to the question of what kind of support can be provided, because the economics of it will not work for the most part. It's just you don't have an economic base anymore in a lot of these communities. And the national advertising that used to appear, so for example, it used to be that if you had a local newspaper, the local Safeway would run, that weekly insert. It doesn't do it, and that doesn't happen anymore. So they've lost a lot of that kind of national advertising that would support them. Another area that we didn't talk about, and it's a fight, an ongoing fight, is legal notices. Legal notices are a significant part of the revenue of a small newspaper. And for the last well, it's been a long time because I was chaired a committee on it when I was on the OMPA board, and that goes back a long time. Jurisdictions have been trying to find ways, understandably, been trying to find ways to cut costs, and one of the ways to cut costs is to figure out a different way to do legal advertising. So you find the cheapest way to, but you're not placing it in the local newspaper anymore. So that's another lost revenue stream. The state could fix that. The state could require legal notices to be published in the local newspaper. Other than that, there's grant funding and things like the legislative efforts that I talked about to provide some kind of relief. And it's not necessarily the state government providing dollars. For example, tax credits. If you provided a tax credit to advertisers or a tax credit to employers who hire journalists, you could generate additional journalism. But the reality is that small-town newspapering is extremely difficult. But I'm going to quickly tell you a story about small-town newspapering and its importance. The New Era in Sweet Home, a couple of years ago, Scott Swanson, who is the owner and publisher, decided to retire. So he sold the newspaper to an employee who bought it with a loan and started, and very quickly, far too quickly, it was discovered that this employee was really not ready to run a newspaper. And after about, I think it was about 18 months, Scott and his wife came out of retirement and took the paper back. Scott ran an editorial on the front page of the New Era, which now not only covers Sweet Home, but also covers Lebanon, where the paper in Lebanon had closed. Ran an editorial kind of explaining the situation and what they were going to do. So the next morning, when he got to the office, there were 5 people standing in front of the door of his newspaper with checks in their hands. One of them, he said, was a 5-figure check, which, as Scott said to me, in our town, that's a lot of money. And he said those people were there because they wanted the newspaper to survive. We saw a similar phenomena here in Eugene with the Weekly, when the Weekly went through its trauma with the embezzlement and what have you, where people stepped forward and made contributions because they understood the importance of the Weekly. So we kind of have to take that kind of energy and figure out how do you then make, those people who stood outside Sweet Home or those who contributed to the Weekly probably aren't going to do it every year from now on. So how do we build that kind of understanding in our communities that these are important local public interest resources that we have to have? And how do we make them successful?
Could you discuss AI more deeply? Any way for the public to know the source of our news?
Well, in the last part, I can talk about the last part of that question, which is the any way question is very simply it's a question of full disclosure. Any news organization that's using AI needs to tell you that it's using AI and how it's using it. Beyond that, AI can be a very valuable tool to use in a newsroom. It can also be a very damaging tool. So, and we're so early in the use of it that it's hard to know exactly which way it's going to go. But it's here. And so I think transparency and disclosure is the critical element, and then smart use of it. And then and one of my hobby horses is, the thing that concerns me about AI is the fact that you're not, the hardest part of writing, as many of you know, is staring at that blank page and writing that first sentence. So if AI doesn't give you a blank page, you never go through that process. And I'm not quite sure exactly why that's such an important part of the process, but it is. And so I'm very concerned about it. I know in terms of the people who are teaching today at all levels of education, from K-12 through higher education, are all trying to figure out how do we use this tool in a way where we teach students what they need to know so they can actually use it productively, and at the same time protect them from the worst aspects of artificial intelligence.
Okay, this one is a very specific question, and you may have seen it in your career. What do you do when management kills a story from the newsroom when the decision seems to be politically motivated?
There was a professor, the legendary professor at the University of Oregon, Dean Ray, who some of you may know. Dean worked at the Registrar for a number of years, and he was on the faculty at Oregon, and he's now, I think, 94 or 95. I saw him just the other day. Dean used to tell students, you have to have enough money to walk away. That when you get asked to do something that is just a total violation of your ethical standards, you've got to be able to walk away. Now that's easy to say and hard to do, but if you're going to do good journalism in any profession, you know, there are ethical standards and you either meet them or you don't. And if you're not going to meet them, go do something else. And unfortunately, we see more and more of this, but we're also, you're seeing, it gets publicized at the national level more than the local level, but you're seeing people who do walk away, and who do protest, and who do say, this is not the way we do news.
Well, we're doing great with the number of questions versus the amount of time we have, so thank you for throwing these in. Do you think President Biden received more coverage of his aging than the current POTUS? If yes, why do you think that's so? Of aging than the current president.
Well, I think there was more coverage of his aging in part because it was hidden for as long as it was. And you know, the reality of news is that, you know, if 100 planes land successfully, nobody reports it, right? And it's that one plane that doesn't land successfully that gets the coverage. In the case of Biden, I think it was a major mistake for what appears to have been the long effort to hide the degree in which he was aging. I mean, that seems to be, I mean, what do I know? I know what I see from afar, but that seems to have been part of what happened. I think you're seeing more references to Trump's aging than we've seen in the past, in part because of his behaviors. But it's also the case that, you know, he is a much more energetic 79 or 80 or whatever he is than Biden was. But I think the critical question there really, I think, does have to do with the fact that they worked very hard to keep Biden's problems private, and thus when they become public, they become much more news.
This one offers you a topic for your next book. How would you change the First Amendment concerning press freedom for contemporary America?
I wouldn't. The First Amendment's actually very short, right? Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, period. There are certainly areas where one could fiddle with it, but I think those initial principles that I talked about of viewpoint discrimination, prior restraint, are kind of the foundations for the First Amendment. And if you start there and understand that the goal is to make sure that the government is not interfering with people's right to speak, then it's not all that complicated. Now, that doesn't mean that individual cases aren't complicated, and it doesn't mean that, for example, trying to figure out, well, where exactly does the internet fit into the 200 and some years of free speech jurisprudence is another question. I'll just use an example, an old example of the struggle. when cable television came along, there was a, 30-year struggle, Q? Is that more or less fair? 30 years? To figure out, is cable television more like print or more like broadcast? And, so the cable operators pounded very hard on saying, we're print. And the regulators pounded very hard and said, no, you're television. And ultimately it was kind of worked out. But my point is that new media, the general tendency is to look at old media and see how new media fit into it. And so with the internet, in effect, what the courts have said is, no, it's a newspaper. In terms of regulatory, we're not going to regulate it the way we regulate broadcast, because broadcasting uses the airwaves, the public airwaves. That's kind of the distinction for broadcasting, right? And there's scarcity in the public airwaves. Now, any economist will tell you that's a crazy argument, that makes no sense from an economist's point of view, but that's the legal principle. So I don't think that the First Amendment needs to be changed at all. And I think if his interpretation is based on those basic concepts of viewpoint discrimination and prior restraint, it solves most of the problems.
Thanks. And this is a related question. A lot of people I know listen to podcasts for their news. What are your thoughts about podcasters?
I like them, I listen to a lot of podcasts too, and I think the podcasts are, I am puzzled because it seems to me that podcasts, it takes a lot of time to get information that you could get much more quickly in another format, but if you like the people and they're enjoyable, they're fine. The critical point I would make there is this. If you don't have a strong fundamental structure of journalism, if you don't have a structure where you've got fact-based reporters going out and getting the news, especially at the local level, sitting in, and I guess, another point, but if you don't have that happening, then the podcasters aren't going to really have anything to talk about. Well, they'll have something to talk about, but it will have no basis in fact. All right, so I think that's a critical distinction. Now, and they're great podcasts. I mean, I listen to, there's some really, they're wonderful, they're good, but you need that underlying structure of journalism to support the whole podcasting world, which is narrowing, as you may have noticed. It is not as economically viable as it initially appeared to be. But are podcasters journalists? It depends on who the podcaster is and what he or she is doing.
This is a double question. What do you think about the Pentagon banishing reporters? What can we as citizens do to protect the freedom of the press?
Well, in the first one, the Pentagon banishing reporters, or as they have most recently with their revised regulations requiring reporters to have escorts when they're in the Pentagon, it's a prior restraint. So what the Pentagon has done is clearly, it's just a prior restraint. There's no way in the world and I think ultimately, hopefully, the Supreme Court will agree because it'll get there, that the Pentagon can tell a reporter, you can't publish information that you have if it's truthful. And they can't ban you from getting that information. I mean, there is no right of access. The Pentagon can say to its people, to people who work in the Pentagon, this is classified information. You cannot release it to the public. And if the person does that, he or she is violating the law. But if the reporter gets that information and he or she did not facilitate the getting of that information, in other words, didn't help somebody break in to get it, the reporter has an absolute right to publish it. Right. So I think that's so that's kind of a prior restraint. The other example is what they've done with the White House press corps. Right, and there, I think that's viewpoint discrimination because you look at who they've allowed in to ask questions of the president. And what they've allowed in are people that like the president. People who don't like the president, you can't come in. All right, so that's just viewpoint discrimination. So in either case, they're violating the First Amendment. What can we do? We can go out and vote. And we can petition, and we can do whatever we can to change the political calculus in Washington.